With pleasure.
So, good afternoon to ma'am, and good evening, good morning, good night, anything to everyone who is watching at whatever time zone you're in. My name is Dr. Shubda Chaudhary, and this is Middle East Insights platform. And today I have a speaker about whom I'll give an introduction, and that will last 1 hour long. That is Dr. Salzberger, Fania Oz-Salzberger, and she is a very, very famous Israeli historian, writer, Professor Emerita of History at University of Haifa School of Law, Haifa Center for German and European Studies, and she has a prolific academic background. She has written a lot of books. She has been teaching at University of Haifa since 1993. Her book Israelis in Berlin, which was published in 2001 in Hebrew and German, became a prism of looking at Israeli-German dialogue through a very secular and different kind of vantage point. She is active on advisory boards of Israel Democracy Institute and German-Israeli Future Forum. Apart from that, she is also a joint editor-in-chief of Haifa University Press from 1996 to 1999. She is director since 2003 of the Posen Research Forum for Jewish, European, and Israeli Political Thought. Dr. Fania was also a fellow of the Institute for Advanced Study in Berlin. She held the Leon Lieberman Chair in Modern Israel Studies at Monash University in Australia's Center for Jewish Civilization. From 2009 to 2010, she was the Lawrence S. Rockefeller Visiting Professor for Distinguished Teaching at University Center for Human Values at Princeton University. And apart from that, she's also from 2016 to 19, she was the director of PAIDIA, the European Institute for Jewish Studies in Sweden. In 2020, she became an honorary doctor at Uppsala University. Out of all her books that she has published, and there are many, the most eye-catching one is the one which she wrote with her father, Jews and Words. That was co-authored. It was a kind of dialogue between her father, Amos Oz, a historian, and she as
Right.
a
The
novelist,
writer, yes.
writer. And unfortunately, we lost one of the most prolific voices of Israel yesterday, today, and in the future, Amos Oz in 2018. But his words, his prophecies, his intellect still remains with anyone who wants to imbibe, learn, unlearn, and relearn. So, with this, ma'am, we are very, very thankful for the privilege of your time and being there with us today.
Thank you very much for inviting me to your wonderful podcast, Dr. Chaudhary, and thank you for this prolific introduction. I'm sorry that my working life has been all too long, so there is too much to talk about. But now we can get to the real business at hand.
Yes. So today we are going to discuss about the basic context is the historical and contemporary complexities in Middle East. So my first question to you is that, like in India, we call Middle East as West Asia. But from Israel's perspective, what exactly is Middle East? Like, how does Middle East define itself technically?
Well, first of all, I want to dwell on another word in your title, and that is complexities.
Yeah.
Complexities and nuances are the center of our story. And you and many of your listeners come from a culture which is a wonderfully storytelling culture. All stories, all histories are intricate. Nothing, almost nothing, is black and white or simple. So if anybody tells you that they took a side in the Middle East and they're absolutely sure that this is the right side, Iran is the right side, Saudi Arabia is the right side, Israel cannot get it wrong, it's always on the right. The Palestinians, being the victims, are the right side to support, and so on. Nothing is straightforward.
Yes.
Everything is complex, not least the history of the Middle East. Now, with mutual agreement, we will not delve into the long history of the Middle East, except to say that this is a region, meaning the whole of Northern Africa and the east part of Asia, especially that bordering on the Mediterranean, has been from time immemorial, under the hoofs, the horses, the riders, the kings of empires. Yeah. Imperialism was more or less invented in the Middle East. And with imperialism came colonialism always. So there have been hordes and throngs and armies of invaders, first the armies, then sometimes the people, the settlers, and the whole of the Middle East is a kind of a mix, like a blender in slow motion. You can still see some strong ethnic groups and parts that have not been completely blended in. It's like a blender in slow motion of societies and nations and ethnic groups and cultures that kept overstepping each other's toes and each other's territories, especially the empires, from Syria to Babylon to Persia, of course, to Greece, to Rome, the Mughal Empire that came from India, the ancient pharaonic Egyptian empire that came before all of these, and into the Middle Ages, the Arab invasions. And we have to remember that too. The Middle East wasn't Arabian in ancient times. It became Arabian towards the late Middle Ages due to empire, due to invasion. There were no critical voices at the time because people didn't know any better. Only when the nation states arrived in the late modern period, in the 19th century, did some societies in Europe, in the Middle East, in Asia, begin to understand their national belonging to a territory. And of course, they had to sometimes to struggle to define border for themselves in areas which were already messed up by the constant march of empires and invasions and settlements in history. And unfortunately for us, Israel and Palestine are smack in the middle of this long-term history. And not only empires right now, also superpowers have been putting their finger in the pie for the last 200 years in terms of modern colonialism, and now are further politicizing and globalizing the conflict. So we Israelis and the Palestinians both have a stake, a claim, and emotional belonging, and some legal stand in a tiny, tiny country that has fewer residents all put together than Delhi or Mumbai. A tiny speck of land that has been, for the last 120 years, been disputed by two nations who deserve to live there, to whom it does belong, both Israelis and Palestinians. And don't be mistaken or misled by terminology. Israel is, of course, a very ancient term. The Israelites lived in the second and the beginning of the first millennium BC, using much the same language and calling themselves Israel or Israelites. Yeah. Whereas the Palestinians do not go that far. The name Palestinians for this particular Arab ethnic group is a fairly late development from the 20th century. And they do hail partially from ancient peoples who lived in the land and partially from the Arab invasion of the Middle Ages, but it doesn't matter anymore. I'm not one of those Jewish Israelis who tell you, oh, we are ancient and they are recent. So we get to win. We get the country. We get the whole land. It all belongs to us. You know, from the river to the sea was a Jewish terminology before it became a Palestinian motto. I don't belong to these people. They are, unfortunately, now a strong group in my society, but they're not the majority. And we don't all heed the sense that there is an overpowering advantage to the Jewish claim on the land. There is a Jewish claim on the land, there is a Palestinian claim on the land. Both should be accommodated. Otherwise, we shall sink into a river of blood, and I think the whole Middle East with us, because the contacts go in every direction. If Iran is, and many of us think it is, the puppet master of the more extremist Palestinian organizations, terror organizations, Hezbollah, Hamas, and others, this means that Iran also wants to work the whole Middle East in its particular direction, which is a particular strain of extreme Islamism, not speaking for the whole of Islam, for the different groups and schools of thought of Islam. But we are up against this, and the Palestinians, I think, against their own interests, against their best interests, are allowing themselves to be led by Iran, perhaps because they didn't get much help from other countries, from other Arab countries, from other members of the global community. What we need in order for the Middle East to calm down, to reconsider its conflicts, its imperial past, its colonial past, its nation-state structure, all these contradictions. What we need is a retreat from the radicals, a retreat from extremism. Would you agree to that?
No, definitely. Any kind of extremist ideology of any form is very, very egregious, and it jeopardizes the entire context for its own agenda.
Oh, yes.
And a lot of innocent lives are lost.
I totally agree. And looking at the history of India, which is not our topic today, but I know that you are well educated in these historical traps that people fall into by following the extremists. So what I'm suggesting for the Middle East, which is very much, I think, what India has been hoping to accomplish in its own history, is a peace of the moderates. A peace of the moderates. They also have to be brave. Not all moderates are brave. A lot of moderate people just sit at home and do nothing. They don't go out, they don't demonstrate, they don't like the situation, but they don't say anything. Some of them don't even go to vote. And that's a shame, because we need brave moderates on both sides. I think especially on the Palestinian side. We need leaders and people to follow the leaders who will say, enough of extremism. We need a practical solution.
Yes.
We need to acknowledge the ongoing existence of Jews and Arabs in this part of the world, and to begin looking for justice based on this assumption. Justice and peace.
That is very true, ma'am. I don't want you to go back and re-traumatize yourself, but I just want to hear from you that what exactly, because it's going to be a year now. So what exactly happened? What we get to know is from the news outlets, social media, all of them have their own agenda. So as a lived experience for you, how did the events unfold last year?
Yes, the 7th of October. This is very hard.
Yeah.
This is very hard because it's very personal, because I know people, I didn't directly know people who were killed. I know people who were kidnapped and taken hostage. And some of the people I love most lost their own loved ones. So it's hard to look back, especially because of I'll give you a crazy fact. I was in India on the 7th of October.
Wow.
I was traveling with my sister-in-law, my beloved sister-in-law. She's a member of Brahma Kumaris.
Yes, yes.
Indian global organization. And she took me for the first time in my life to India, to a meditation retreat in the mountains of Rajasthan.
Okay.
And imagine the calm, the beauty, the wonderful people we met. There were people from all over the world. We were in peace and harmony, truly, not the mottos. It was very quiet and gentle. And then came the Saturday morning, which was the last day of the retreat. And I got the very first WhatsApp announcement on my phone from a mutual friend saying about a third friend. I'm in touch with him, but it doesn't look good. And I didn't understand what happened to that friend. Is he sick? And that friend was a kibbutznik. He lived in a kibbutz, one of the kibbutz that was most savagely attacked by Hamas terrorists that morning. And he was alone in his home holding the door of his safe room like so many hundreds of others that terrible day. And they tried to break in, they didn't. He's a painter, so they ended up shooting up all the paintings that were hanging in his living room, but he survived. He survived. Immediately after that came a barrage of media reports and reports from friends and family, some of them in the attacked area crying for help. It was like a tsunami of calamity. And the first horrendous stories began to emerge. Now, some of those first horrendous stories were wrong or exaggerated because, it's like an earthquake, a city gets hit, you get immediately all sorts of rumors and myths. But unfortunately, most of the stories were real. And they were real because we could see them online, especially I being abroad and looking at all sorts of channels, social media. I wish I could have unseen those pictures. But what you saw was pictures of people, civilians, families, children being shot, being held captive in their own homes before they were taken hostage. A family was gathered around the body of the oldest daughter that had been shot, and the terrorists were sitting there laughing at them and threatening that they would be the next terrible physical and psychological torment. And then began the horror stories from the venue of the music festival, the Nova Festival, with horrific phone calls of survivors, people hiding, calling radio station, help me, call the police. And the police didn't come, and the army was late, and the whole security system of Israel was having a very bad day. It was also a national holiday, and nobody expected the attack, and it was a complete disaster. But the sheer barbarity, the human depravity shown by Hamas that day has irreversibly injured and traumatized a whole nation, the Israeli nation, to the degree that until today, unfortunately, morally wrong, but until today most of us, except for a minority of very conscientious people, most of us find it very difficult to empathize emotionally with innocent victims in Gaza. Very difficult. We do it. We are angry at some of the things that are being done in Gaza in our name. We think that we had to fight the war against Hamas, but we could have fought it differently. We could have fought it more smartly, more cautiously. Maybe we could have negotiated for the 240 hostages we had in Gaza on that horrible day, and only then reckoned what to do with the brutes of Hamas. But we didn't, because we happen to have a bad national leadership these days. The bad national leadership sprang into the war like a thug wishing to punch as many thugs from the enemy side as possible. Never mind the innocents around. I don't think Israel intends to target innocents in Gaza, but Gaza is one huge, crowded plot of earth. And by going for the guilty, I think that my government and army did not consider the innocents enough. So all this is an ongoing calamity. We are still on the 7th of October. We are still finding out horrible facts about the 7th of October. More and more stories are coming out. Families are telling what they know. Released hostages. And of course, the murdered hostages, 6 of them only last week. And last night we were shown the tunnel in which they were held, which was worse than a horror movie torture chamber. For months and months, and they survived this torture chamber until their captors shot them in the head. We're still living on the 7th of October. And as long as we have hostages and stories coming and thousands of traumatized survivors, and Hezbollah shooting at us from the north, and much of our south and much of our north evacuated and people living in temporary housing, as long as Israel is there, Israelis, ordinary Israelis, will find it very hard to make judicious judgments about the present and the future. The people who should have been the responsible adults in Israel, let alone Palestine, the government, have betrayed their role as responsible adults by delving trigger happily into a full war in Gaza, and what now looks increasingly like a greater war in the Middle East, perhaps with Hezbollah, perhaps directly with Iran, we don't know. But I'm in the horrible situation of being injured, badly injured as a society, as a civil society, and being ruled by a government that most of us by now distrust. It's not a good for helping peace to move forward.
Yeah. So, ma'am, when there are more than 500,000 Israelis who come out and protest, asking, have the hostage deal, get the hostages back. What kind of pressures do you think that Netanyahu is undergoing, that he's not taking a hostage deal, first? And second, what are the threats that are faced by these activists like you when you go out in the open and you critique the government? Because whenever in any kind of context, in any country, if the citizens protest and dissent, there is always some kind of state-sponsored violence or some kind of surveillance or some way to keep everyone in check.
Well, in terms of freedom of speech and freedom of, until recently, freedom of protest, Israel has been a strong democracy. It's a weak democracy on some other things, like keeping the occupied territories, Gaza, and especially the West Bank, for so many years under occupation. This is undemocratic. But within Israel's own civil society, freedom of speech has been more or less well preserved. And we were able, I've been dissenting with many of my governments ever since I was 17 years old, and I went out and demonstrated. And the worst I got was a little tear gas when we got too close to the prime minister's house many, many years ago. Now it's changing because the big demonstrations we are going on are getting violence from two directions, from right-wing extremists who come to the edge of the demonstration looking for trouble and try to beat people up and to frighten people. And secondly, and most and worst, the Israel police, which is now, as you may know, is controlled by the so-called Minister of National Security, Itamar Ben-Gvir, coming from the worst extreme right, very far right, nationalist, racist party. Everything is interconnected, Shubda, and I will explain. Even before the 7th of October, we knew something bad was coming because there was already the rolling drums of what we call a revolution from above, a coup d'etat. They used to call it in all the history books. Netanyahu had been prime minister of Israel on and off for already 20 years when he was indicted by the court on three counts of corruption: accepting bribes, giving people all sorts of favors, deep end corruption. And that happened in 2019. And the Supreme Court still allowed him, even with these counts against him, to run for the elections. He ran for the elections, won once, lost a second time, and by the third time, that was back in 2022, the trial still hovering above him. In 2032, Netanyahu, once again, the nation, after 4 rounds of elections, almost twice a year, nation is cut in half between center-left Arab parties and right and extreme right and the ultra-Orthodox parties. And Netanyahu realized that for the first time, he will need to take into his government, coalition and cabinet, the extreme right parties. Smotrich and Ben-Gvir and their fellow Knesset members, parliamentarians who are openly and proudly nationalistic, believe in Jewish supremacy, believe in Israel's total right over the whole of the ancestral land. They have a racist agenda of which they are proud. They are anti-Arab, anti-Palestinians. Their end game is to create such havoc in Israel-Palestine that under the smoke and forcefully they would evict the Palestinians from the land. They call it, because they have to be legal, they call it persuade the Palestinians to emigrate of their own will. But this is a lie. The idea is forceful eviction. And of course, they don't care about Palestinian lives. These people are the settlers, not all, but many of the settlers in the West Bank. These people are the extreme racists that every Western society has, but very few put them into the coalition and cabinet. Some of them do now, but they don't face what we are facing. So Netanyahu took these people on and gave them everything they wanted: control of the police, Ben-Gvir, and full civil control of the West Bank, Smotrich, which has been already before the 7th of October transformed into something like, it's already been, an occupied territory with human rights in question mark, but there was at least a Palestinian Authority, there were Palestinian areas. Smotrich and his people want to eradicate that. They want a full takeover of the whole West Bank and Gaza by Israelis, by Israeli settlers. They want to undo the Palestinian Authority, not only Hamas, which I also want to undo, but the Palestinian Authority, the more moderate leadership in the West Bank. And they want to go back to the biblical, historical state of Israel. And Netanyahu knew all that. Now, he's more cautious than that. He's used to be more pragmatic than that, but he didn't care anymore. All he wants is to stay in government, to stay in power, and to hold off his trial forever, so that he will never lose force, never lose the government, the prime ministership, and never lose his freedom if he's ever sentenced to prison. It has become a personal struggle, self-interested battle of Netanyahu and his families and handful of cronies against the rest of the nation. Everything else is a tool in his hand, including the extremists, including the ultra-Orthodox. He's buying their support by paying them billions of taxpayers' money for their own education system and the system that allows them not to work, not to serve in the army, and so on. Alongside that, he had been building for a long time, comparable to Trump, but longer than Trump, a media machine of voices totally echoing his own will and messages, what we call the poison machine in the social media, in one or two television channels, in two or three radio channels, but this is spread all over the country, which is a small country, placing every center or left-wing politician, or even a right-wing politician who disagrees with Netanyahu, in a demonized image, encouraging Israelis to hate the other half of Israelis, portraying the left wing as traitors and enemies and friends of Hamas. When the 7th of October happened, many of us thought that now the nation will unite against the horror, the devil itself, the Hamas attack, the Hamas rule of Gaza. But that happened only at a very early phase and quite superficially. Before long, we realized that Netanyahu was still attacking us, that he was still trying to undermine democracy by weakening, as he did before, the Supreme Court, the separation of powers, the independence of the judiciary. After the whole parliament, his half of the parliament is completely obedient to him, no opposition forces within the coalition. So he's once again hard at work in undoing Israeli democracy, aided by the so-called Minister of Justice, Yariv Levin, whose agenda is a bit like the United States Plan 25, to make the judiciary and especially the Supreme Court into the servant, the obedient servant of the executive. So no more balance, checks, separation of powers. Only now it's much more horrible because we are fighting a terrible war while our democracy is crumbling from within. And the hostage issue has become the litmus test of this enormous abyss between ruler and citizens. Because Netanyahu and the extreme right, Smotrich and Ben Gvir, do not want or need the hostages back. They want full war. They want to annihilate Gaza. They call it annihilate Hamas, but they want to annihilate Gaza. They want a second front in Lebanon and perhaps another front with Iran. Why? Why is it good for them? Well, for Netanyahu, it's good because he stays in power. As long as there is a war, there will be no elections. And his trial is moving at snail's pace. And it is good for the extreme right because they believe that they can take over the ancestral land of Israel, clear it, ethnically cleanse it of the Arab group, the Arab minority, and rule with the help of some god or messianic powers that they believe in. And we don't. We believe in pragmatism, we believe in humanism. We want to lower the flames, we want to save the innocents of Gaza, first of all, to save our own hostages, to bring them home. Whoever has remained, maybe just a few dozens by now. And we want to start a Middle Eastern global process of compromise, territorial agreement. Moving forward, I hope, not all Israelis, but I hope, to a two-state model, Israel next door to Palestine.
These are very deep words, and all of them carry enormous amount of meaning. And what do you think, ma'am, that today, for example, at 6:30 a.m. IST, so yesterday's night, there was a debate between Kamala Harris and and Trump for the presidential debate.
Yes.
Do you think that any one of them who comes to power has any kind of hegemony in the entire state structure of US and bureaucracy to put pressure on Netanyahu or to change things?
This is a good question. And the last American president to press Netanyahu gently and believe Netanyahu's excuses and alibis and postponements was Joe Biden. By the way, a wonderful man. When he came to Israel just after the 7th of October, he actually met and hugged victims and cried with them, something that no minister of the Netanyahu government ever did. He gave us the human touch. He gave Israel support and weapons and time, a time frame with which we were hoping to defeat Hamas. That did not happen, and Biden increasingly has been feeling that Netanyahu lied to him. He actually said it out loud. So Netanyahu is very capable of, he's really an artist of postponement and disguise. But neither Trump nor Kamala Harris believe Netanyahu anymore. So in that case, whatever happens in November, this coming year in the American presidential elections, will be a decisive moment for Israel, because I believe that both Trump, who is unpredictable in many ways, and certainly Harris would be pushing Netanyahu to end this horrible chapter in our history, this way or the other. However, what is no less important than the Israeli perspective is the American perspective, the US perspective, and the global perspective for all of us. You know, there are other powers in the world who are on the rise. There are anti-democratic powers in the world who are on the rise. There is Russia, there is China. We need a well-governed United States, and I say it not just as an Israeli, not just as a Middle Easterner. And on this, my own view, and that of about a quarter of the Israelis, I think people who are better informed, but only a quarter. My view is that Kamala Harris is a far preferable candidate to Donald Trump. Also for Israel. She may be tough on our government. I want people to be tough on our government. But she is not a one-sided pro-Palestinian. I take her to be pro-innocence and pro-peace.
Yes.
I share the same view.
Yeah. Though I'm still a bit skeptical of her. I'm very skeptical of Trump, but skeptical of her because she doesn't really have any kind of past experience in foreign policy. So how does the entire bureaucracy, because once you get the chair changes you.
Yes, of course it does. And you must have a very quick learning curve. But I want to remind you that Kamala Harris has been vice president for almost 4 years now.
Yeah.
Vice president, very much exposed to every brief in foreign policy, even if she doesn't call the shots and make the decisions. And before that, she was a member of the Senate Intelligence Committee, which is not a policy committee, but Intelligence Committee is not trivial at all. And she has common sense and values and education. So whatever the future brings in terms of foreign policy, the question is not so much the extent of experience, but the extent of the next president's guts, if you excuse my...
Yes. No, it's true.
And I believe that she might have that kind of steel in her, and of course, a far better conscience to make demands of the dictators of this world.
Yeah. It was yesterday's whatever sneak peek I've had, it's Trump 2.0, very similar to what he was before. But, and he's a businessman. He looks at everything from the business perspective, doesn't really matter innocent lives or human rights or humanitarian, developmental aid. He look at it from all the business aspects. And even Putin has endorsed Kamala Harris, saying that she has infectious laughter.
I think that Putin, yes, did it in a clownish sort of way. But, it's enough. It's enough, really, Shubda, to look at the way that Trump regards women
Yes, yes,
Such an easy test to see whether the person is a humanist or anti-humanist.
yes. That
If he
is,
doesn't care about women, why would he care about any human being in the world?
I don't think he's gender specific when it comes to caring. He's gender neutral when it comes to not caring about anyone, so, and
Yeah.
himself. And uh, so, ma'am, now over the period of time, as how over the period of time now, with so much of the Philadelphia corridor and so much of negotiations happening and the pending ceasefire talks. I've kept like lost track of how many times the ceasefire talks, what is the longevity of it. And tomorrow we are coming to 31 years, day after tomorrow, 31 years of Oslo Accords, 13th
I would.
September 1993. And it's been a process without peace. So when you talk about a two-state solution, um, what do you mean by a two-state solution in today's context, taking into consideration whatever has happened?
Yes, I was very close to the Oslo Accords. I just came back in September 93. My husband and I came back from 6 years in Oxford with our PhDs and started teaching at the University of Haifa. And Israel looked new to us and very promising. And there was a big excitement in the air about Yitzhak Rabin's leadership and the Oslo Accords. Now, the Oslo Accords did not exactly fail, they stagnated due to a wave of violent terror incidents. Each side is blaming the other for fanning that wave. But the fact is that they were stopped. I think that mostly because Rabin was assassinated in 95 by a Jewish extremist called Yigal Amir. That was the end of the spirit of leadership that the Israeli center left had. Since Rabin, we haven't managed, unfortunately, to bring forth quite such a leader, charismatic, quiet, calm, very reasoned, very persuasive, and working for the good. The Israeli center left has had several leaders, none of them up to that mark. On the other hand, the Likud, at around the same time, raised, after the founding generation had gone, Begin and Shamir, raised Benjamin Netanyahu, a young maverick. Nobody knew of him in the early 90s, but very quickly he came to the fore using mainly charisma, big words, quite the opposite of Rabin, selling promises and deals and all sorts of plans and programs. Most of them never materialized. Where in fact he began, even before he became corrupt and aligned with the extreme right, he became as a very hawkish, very national right leader, not in a fascist way to begin with, but he wanted to undo the Oslo Accord for any price. And the price he was willing to pay already in the 90s, we have this. He was willing to pay was to strengthen Palestinian extremists, such as the recently founded organization, Islamist organization Hamas, in order for them to counter the moderate Palestinians, or those who have become more moderate, Fatah, the Palestinian, the PLO, who are willing to negotiate a territorial deal with Israel. So from the very beginning, Netanyahu and his Likud, and I'm not sure that the previous Likud members would have gone with this, but he took Likud and shifted it even further to the right by saying, we shall not have and agree with the Palestinians, we want it all. From the river to the sea, that was a Likud platform quote, before it became an extreme Palestinian quote on the other side. From the river to the sea, it will be Jewish Israel, and that is why we are encouraging the Islamists, because better the devil you can keep at bay than somebody who pretends to be your friend and makes a peace agreement with you, and then you lose half of your biblical land. People like me, of course, and there was a majority of supporters of the Oslo Accord, were willing to give up, the conquered territories, not legally ours, but even as our biblical lands, in return for some sort of stable coexistence, perhaps peace on the horizon with the Palestinians. Those were the 1990s. And it failed. It failed due to Netanyahu, although he was still in the opposition. It failed because Rabin was assassinated, and because there was no natural heir, and because violence erupted. Some violence from the Jewish side, including a terrible massacre by a Jewish doctor in the cave of the patriarchs in Hebron. And then ongoing terrorist massacre, the Second Intifada, in which over 1,000 Jewish civilians were killed. That was before 9/11. I'm sorry, that was before the 7th of October, 20 years before, the Second Intifada. So after that, the left lost its footing because the Oslo process had failed and Rabin was not there anymore. And it seemed that the Palestinians only want to shoot at us. And Netanyahu got wings and flew high, becoming the kind of self-centered, egocentric, very, very greedy, also in material terms, in money terms, and eventually corrupt leader of the Israeli right wing and the Israeli lower classes who always vote for him, seeing him as the alternative to the elites. In many ways like Trump, but on a ground far more dangerous and shifting than Trump has been, at least.
No, I agree. Over the period of time, like my own personal journey of understanding the cause, initially I was so emotional and one-sided that it would have been very difficult for me to even have a conversation, a balanced conversation with someone who is Israeli. And that was the entire brainwashing, or my own, maybe no one did it, my own emotional reflex. But over the period of time, when I started inculcating and making friends, and understanding, especially after 7th of October, something that I talked with a Palestinian and he said, when two elephants fight, it is the grass that suffers, Shubda. So it started making me change my lens and stop seeing things as so black and white.
Which is what makes you and your podcast so fascinating. I've looked at some of the back videos, and you really bring different voices, different people. Yeah. And once again, because I'm reaching out to you in gratefulness, in gratitude for you having reached out to me, I would like to repeat what I said in the beginning. We need a coalition of the moderates.
Yes.
So next week.
Yeah.
Next week, I'm going to South Africa for an
all the best
Israeli-Palestinian global conference.
Yeah.
Which we'll talk, and I'm hoping that what is common to all of us is a degree of moderation.
Yes.
That is to compromise. Compromise is considered something weak, something bad. I'm a lover of compromises. That's why I've been married for the last 32 years. Compromises are a good thing.
Yes. And ma'am, what is your last message to young students who are watching you right now?
Please address the complexities. Please watch the nuance. Please believe in human beings, both in Israel and in Palestine. Please single out the moderates and try to turn your back on the extremists. Do not buy the river to the sea, except for the general motto, let's have peace from the river to the sea. Yes. But sometimes a compromise and a territorial partition is the right solution so that we can all live and not die. It's that simple.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you so much for the privilege of your time. And because the flow of this podcast is in such a way that I am not going to edit it. and I'm not going to upload it into one or two parts. The entire podcast will be uploaded in one part so that the flow of emotion, impact, and your presence continues without break.
Thank you
And
so much.
yeah,
Thank you.
and thank you. And I don't need to edit anything in this at all. And once again, I'm very, very thankful. And talking with you is also at a personal level a indication of growth for me, because not only did I get to learn so much from you, ma'am, though I like the fact that you were in India at that time, but not
Yeah.
any other context of it. But uh, it also tells me, it also shows to me that how much I have unlearned and relearned over the past. And now, when I always say to my students that every human life is important, your lecture will give me so many examples to further tell them with historical narratives and contemporary narratives about Middle East and what we are going through. Do not look at it only as a screen, as a TV screen, or a phone screen, alienated from your own world, and you shouldn't care about it because it's not happening to you. But the fact that humanity has no border, humanity has no boundary, it's fluid. Empathy is fluid. And the very fact that out of your busy schedule, you took a time for our students, and anyone who is watching the podcast and has made so far till here, I'm thankful to all of you. And thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you for these wise words, Dr. Chaudhary, and maybe we shall meet in person one of these days.
Yes.
The world
Yes.
is not that large.
Yes. Toda.
Thank you. Bevakasha and peace. Shalom.
Bye.